Hello and welcome to the Ori Spotlight podcast. I am your host, Jason Foster. This week we have Carl from DeciBio with us. Carl, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you, Jason.
I was going to give your last name a go unprompted, but then I knew I would butcher it. Give it to our audience so we know how to pronounce it properly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Carl Schoellhammer. It's like Dr. Scholl's at a hammer. You're good.
Perfect. Dr. Schoellhammer. Excellent. Well, it's a great place to start is you. Just kind of, if you don't mind, telling us a little bit about your background and particularly about DeciBio, what you guys do, and how you get involved in cell and gene therapy.
Yeah. So DeciBio is a strategy boutique consulting shop. Been around for a little over a decade now, about 50 people, really with a historic focus on tools and diagnostics for precision medicine. So next generation tools, things like, NGS, a lot of liquid biopsy in the realm of cancer. The practice of, our advanced therapies practice, which I lead, really started more organically. The field, started realizing, hey, we need tools. We need a little more help here on the bioprocessing aspect. And so folks looked around for who knew tools, and we had been in tools since before tools were cool. Or maybe they're not cool, but they're cooler now. So folks found us, came to us, and we started, helping them that way, thinking about bioprocessing, QC/QA, really on the technical front. And then the practice has grown from there. So now obviously doing a lot of work for pharma directly, thinking about pipeline prioritization, forecasting, market viability of programs, just given the flourishing of pipelines, really, thinking really carefully through that. So we help our clients with that sort of material as well. Everything in between. We do try and still take, quite a technical lens. We pride ourselves on really, knowing that aspect, being fairly deep technically, because ultimately, that's what the science requires, and that's what the science dictates in cell and gene therapy.
And I can't remember, do you have a scientific or technical background yourself?
I do. I wasn't smart enough to do something else, so I did a PhD. I went to MIT. I trained with Bob Langer. I started my own company with Bob. I ran there for a number of years in the drug delivery space. So that's where I sort of got my initial, cutting of the teeth, thinking about, raising money, strategy, doing all those things. I was able to do a couple of transactions. And then I grew up on the West Coast in Los Angeles. I had the opportunity to come back. I took it. My blood never thickened. So, when it hit 50 or below in Boston, my parka would come out. But came back to LA. And what I wanted to do was really think about what I had been doing at my company, but now on a broader scale. So thinking about strategy and market level implications, across groups, across entities, across modalities, really. So I found DeciBio, one of the, few kind of biotech or life science shops in Los Angeles. Joined them, and I've been here a little over 4.5 years now.
Match made in heaven, sounds like. That's great. I should have told you ahead of time that, and I'm sorry for not doing so, on the Spotlight podcast, we banned the use of the phrase tools. We call them enabling technologies because, as you said, tools aren't sexy, but enabling technologies are very sexy, especially now when we realize what having the lack of them does to the potential for some of these incredible therapeutics, which is most of what we're going to talk about today. So I don't think there's an electric shock or anything if you say tools, but we can
okay, good.
Together we can help
tools and devices.
Together we can help enable the industry to change its lexicon to be more forward thinking.
I love it. I'm here for
Excellent.
it. I'm here for it.
Yeah, I think it's partially the analyst's fault because that's the bucket they put companies like us in, is tools and diagnostics. So, but you mentioned a key word actually when you were talking about what DeciBio does, which I want to spend a lot of time on today if we can, which is viability. And how do we assess viability? We know that traditionally the industry has looked at, the industry, and I mean biopharma in general, not just cell and gene, biopharma in general, and the investors that invest in therapeutics have been singularly focused on safety and efficacy. Safety and efficacy are the things that move the needle. They are the things that give us value inflections.
Yeah.
They're the things that mean, success or failure. Those are the pivot points traditionally. And I would argue that it's time for us to elevate a third pillar, not just safety and efficacy, but also viability, particularly when we talk about cell and gene. We can no longer assume viability as we might have once done with small molecules or even biologics that, eventually we'll get the cost down. Eventually we'll be able to make a lot of them. Eventually we'll be able to treat lots of patients. We're in our 8th year post-approval of the first cell therapies. We've got, 7 approved products, cell therapies. We've got, a dozen gene therapies. We've got a dozen different companies in this space. And it really jumped out to me when I think it was the CEO of Bluebird and one of the senior execs at Vertex were doing the state of the industry at JP Morgan this year. And I think it was the CEO of Bluebird said, you know what, we are manufacturing companies. We have to realize that we are manufacturing companies. We're not drug discovery companies anymore. And I thought that was a real kind of inflection moment in my mind. And I wonder tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that, whether I'm being overly dramatic or whether, some of the work you're doing with clients really is coming to hone in on this viability question. And we can talk about what I mean when I say viability, and maybe it's the same or different when you say it. But give me your thoughts on that as a thesis.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll call out, you skipped Provenge, Pro 14 plus years ago. So but that really seeded kind of cell therapy, that was 1.0 and seeded into 2.0. We did a write-up with an individual who's at Dendron during those times recently, and he made the point that they took kind of the typical approach of pharma, developing biologics at that time, which was build out tremendous capacity, build out a bunch of tanks, have it all ready to go for launch. And then what ultimately happened on launch was completely new therapy, right? Delays from regulatory perspectives, delays from payer perspectives, even a physician community that was unsure about, the mechanism of action. Can you stimulate the immune system to fight cancer? Obviously, nobody questions that today. But so they built out all this capacity and then, didn't ultimately need it. And I think that highlights a couple of things to your point, really around what's needed for cell therapy 2.0. You need scalability. On day one, you're not going to have a Humira on your hands. So you need a scalable approach. You probably need some element of decentralization, just from a logistics standpoint, trying to, especially in the setting of autologous, sending material back and forth, from effectively the patient and back. And you need to make sure that the quality is there, kind of your viability piece, I think. And that's where the field needs to go. But old habits die hard. So you have biopharma that, forgot the days of early biologics, which probably saw a lot of the same hurdles, but is now at a mature state that can produce large volumes of drug. It's not personalized. They send it out. They think of, for example, QC/QA as a hurdle, to putting out some of these materials. Where in cell and gene therapy, I really see that as hand in hand with the manufacturing and can be, again, an enabler of these therapies, enabler of better efficacy, better potency, shorter turnaround time. I worked at Merck and Company in their vaccines division, a decade plus ago. And you had the QC/QA division as a bit of a hurdle, right? They have to, you make your drug product, goes to them, they do their tests. Well, sometimes you'd have a sterility issue, right? And the question was always, well, was that entire can of drug product, did it really have a contamination? Or did just the quality lab, have an issue with their SOP, not follow something, contaminate it? It doesn't matter either way. You throw away the drug product and, you do an investigation and that sort of thing. And so I think that's what biopharma thinks about. They think about, okay, QC is the lab over there. They do their tests. They're kind of the police or
it's all done at the very end. They kind of check it,
Exactly. But in cell and gene therapy, you can have analytics and better assays to pick out the cell that actually recognizes and kill cancer. Just put that cell back into patients. Now you have lower cell numbers, shorter expansion times. It truly kind of puts the historic model, on its head of now your QC/QA can enable that. We always joke internally, we've been thinking about that space for a number of years. We made a slide in particular on that area in terms of kind of unmet need or opportunities within QC/QA a couple of years back. We haven't had to change it because nothing's changed.
Still a big unmet need.
Nothing's changed.
Yeah, exactly.
Still a lot of unmet need. Still a lot of unmet need. Exactly.
No, I agree with that. I think the application of some of the lessons from biologics are relevant and have been put in place, but we've lost, I think, some of the nuance and the fact that these are personalized medicines. So in the autologous world, at least right now, we're making one dose for one patient. The fact that they're living medicines, and so we need to monitor their, evolution, shall we call it, whether it be expansion or genetic evolution or phenotypic evolution over time. But we can do these things in line. We can do these things in real time, potentially, rather than having to wait till the end and finding out yes or no that one patient's batch wasn't good or was out of spec or was potentially failed sterility. So it's these kinds of things. I agree. Analytics is one of the biggest unmet needs today in cell and gene. But I think this kind of nuance of having personalized medicines for an individual patient and having to go through that QA and QC process every single time for every single dose brings with it a whole host of complexity that we haven't really wrapped our heads around yet. To go back to the viability point, I want to be clear that what I mean when I say that, and we can debate whether I'm, being crazy or not, which is usually the case, to say, investors are strongly advocating for early stage companies or academic spin-outs to race into the clinic and get a safety signal, get a efficacy signal. This is what a value inflection means for them. And they can go out and raise money, and then they can kind of spin the company out, and they can partner potentially. These are really important milestones for them, and they will continue to be. What I am arguing, however, is that if we forget about viability at the early phase, before we get into the clinic, and when I say viability, I mean things like manufacturability, I mean market access, I mean cost of goods, I mean throughput, ability to supply the market. And that might include decentralized models, it might include centralized models, but how are we going to make these products? How are we going to deliver them to patients? And how are we going to get them paid for? That's what I mean when I say like commercially viable in order to have the big clinical impact that we want to have. Because ultimately, you can have very safe products, you can have very efficacious products. And if they're not commercially viable, they'll never see the light of day. They won't treat patients, they won't have the clinical impact, and they won't deliver the ROI. And so that's something I think that today, in today's world, is starting to be more and more talked about, but has been largely ignored over the last 7 years in our race to get that traditional safety or efficacy signal and get the products on the market.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And a significant example of that was probably over the last year and a half. Every cell therapy company suddenly becoming a immunology and inflammation company, and rolling out their expanded pipeline of all these assets for I&I type indications. And while some of those, certainly could be viable as you put it, right, from a market standpoint, financial standpoint, a lot of those won't be. I mean, in the the US at least, right, we pay for cancer treatments, kind of hands down. So a cell therapy for an oncology application doesn't have a lot of the same questions as, say, a cell therapy for now an I&I. And you're starting to see kind of that pullback. That was one of our predictions at the beginning of this year, at least, in cell therapy, was probably a lot of those programs, kind of disappear back off of folks' pipeline.
Yeah.
And I think you're seeing quite a bit of that, now.
Yeah. No, just to follow on that point. I mean, obviously, I think CellPoint Galapagos was the first to say publicly that we're not going to pursue that any longer with our cell therapy programs. Someone said to me today that there are 24 cell therapies for lupus alone, focused in lupus. And I don't know if that number rings a bell to you or if that's an order of magnitude, close, but clearly we don't need 24 cell therapies for lupus.
Yeah.
And so a differentiator, and if we're using T cells, let's say we're using a CAR T approach, in most of those, are we going to differentiate them on safety and efficacy? It seems to me relatively unlikely.
Yeah, probably not.
But where we will be able to differentiate them potentially is our ability to make them and ability to deliver them and have them be cost effective and covered and available potentially earlier in treatment. Who knows? So this is what I mean when I say viability. Is there, I would argue, and I think you're arguing the same, that it's unlikely the market has room for 24 products that are going to be viable to treat lupus. in cell therapy. So the couple that probably win in that space tick all three of those boxes. They're safe, they're efficacious, and they have a viable path to market and to serve that patient population in a large scale way. I mean, something like 50,000 patients a year are available in the lupus indication. We can scratch the surface on that. We'd be lucky right now with today's, methodologies to
each
treat
one of those products
500.
can sell to two people.
Exactly. We know how that goes.
You're good.
That hasn't proven to be very good, a very good model thus far. Unfortunately for the gene therapies mostly. So.
Yeah, I mean, the AAV space saw this right with the boom during the pandemic. We curate our own internal drug trackers across, cell therapy, gene therapy, et cetera. I think at the height of the pandemic, there was something like an average of, 4 AAV programs for any given indication, just, globally on average. And exactly to your point, if you're third line in, say, hemophilia, or third to market in hemophilia, where some of those therapies are effectively, quotes, curative, are you viable? Are you market viable? I would argue probably not.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think actually, interestingly, and this is kind of where I was trying to take this thinking, and again, tell me if I've strolled off course, but potentially all manufacturing, efficiency on delivery becomes a competitive advantage. It hasn't really ever been. I mean, all the big pharmas had big factories and they could stamp out tablets at the same, unit costs of pennies. But that was replicable with enough capital. And I wonder if, a doctor is trying to choose between this product, let's not pick only on I&I, let's, just go back to leukemia or lymphoma or myeloma. This product that I'm pretty sure I can get in the time that my patient has, within the next week or two, that I know will be covered, that I know, I can get a slot for, versus this other one that maybe it's marginally more effective, a couple percentage points, who knows? But I'm not quite sure if they can get it. There might be a longer lead time. There might not be a manufacturing slot. Potentially supply becomes a competitive advantage in this space. It might not be scale. Then we might have different models. Distributed manufacturing might be a model that evolves. But the ability to supply, having a viable product that's covered and that you can make, becomes potentially a competitive advantage. And even if you are third to market, but your cost of goods are half what the first two are, and you have, the ability to get to first line or second line and actually supply, maybe there is a viability opportunity there, but not unless you tick that box early in development. That's my point, is that it's not being done early enough. We kick this can down the road. We'll sort that out later. We'll sort out manufacturing later. We're really concerned about safety and efficacy and only now. And we've seen that over and over again in this space, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't turned out very well. I hope our friends at Iovance are successful with their, the first TIL for solid tumors for melanoma. But I think they're going to face some of these challenges, unfortunately.
I have a little bit of a different take on Iovance, at least. They were, I'll call it maybe the happy accident or the happy roadblock, right? They had significant CMC issues, right, which kicked back their approval, obviously. But what they did during that time was then set up all this compassionate use stuff. So they had, I think it was, 50 plus sites basically up and running. That gave time for physicians to, become more familiar, with the procedure and how it works, patients to become more familiar, all these things. So, significant setback to not get approval. But then in those intervening, a couple of years, when they finally got approval, they now had that kind of operational organization set up. They had the dosing centers. Physicians were now familiar with this product, had already used the product, patients similarly. I think that's going to be a significant benefit for them as they now, get further into their launch. And I'm wondering if that doesn't in some way become a bit more of a model for subsequent companies of, I don't know that they go through the full setting up compassionate use, early, let's say, but to have kind of the centers up and running, physicians, educated and familiar with using that product, I think that's going to do a lot of good for their ultimate, rollout. Yeah. And I'm interested to see if, other companies, maybe adopt a piece or two of that. I think it goes back to your point of how can you de-risk some of the manufacturability, scalability, earlier, and you've got to do it obviously in a capital, efficient way. I mean, to the same extent, if your product isn't yet, safe or efficacious, or you don't know that yet, it'd be tough to, build out a whole facility or a whole, organization really. So to do it in that kind of distributed way, do it potentially with a service provider, something like that, where you can have the proof point of, okay, we've done a couple technical runs. We have confidence that, this is a process that works, it scales, they can be cheaper. That's, value inflection, and shows it while you're still showing kind of the efficacy, the safety in parallel.
No, I hope you're right. And I can see how that kind of, let's call it pump priming or building out the infrastructure, should help them get a faster and hopefully smoother uptake and treat more patients early, which would be great. I had a couple conversations, I would say that investors play a big role in this. The investors, the way they're kind of encouraging their companies or pushing their companies, what are they focused on? Therapeutics investors particularly have a role to play here. I've been encouraged, a couple of conversations I had in Rome for a meeting on the med, where I had a couple of CDMOs say to me that, alongside a client, they sort of brought a process to their board and said, we think this is ready to get into the clinic. This is what the mandate you gave us. And the board asked questions about manufacturability, about cost of goods, about scalability. And at the end decided, we think you should go back and do another loop, do another iteration. Don't rush into the clinic now. We don't think you've hit, the TPP, the target product profile, as we might call it as pharma marketers, that you need for this product to be viable. I had two different, instances of that, and maybe it's, recency bias on my part, but I'd like to say that there are certainly investors out there that are thinking this way. I don't know how much work you do in the investment community, but I'm sure you're having some of these conversations with your clients as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things we did as a firm, we started a really small venture fund as well, in partnership with Broad Oak Capital. And that's something that I help lead from the Deci side and as sort of advisors for them. And the fund is meant to invest purely in enabling technologies. I like that. We generally say tools, but enabling technologies. And so we certainly, with our investor hat on, will directly push a little bit of that too. Now, these are obviously the technology direct companies. So we kind of push them in the lens of, how do you need to think about approaching biopharma? And as a result, what is your value prop that you're communicating to biopharma? And it's around those points. And then similarly in our consulting, when we are working with, investors, PE, et cetera, I think they are asking more of those questions now today, particularly PE, when they're doing, roll-ups, and, roll-ups have become more and more, exciting in the life science space for PE. I mean, since kind of KKR's sale of LGC a number of years ago, I think that really kicked off the interest. But particularly those sorts of investors, I think, think quite heavily about this and quite deeply about this. How can you build sort of an integrated organization that serves biopharma? And it's probably not that exciting if it's serving biopharma in the same historic manner of, hey, once biopharma is late enough, then we can sell to them. It's really helping them think through, putting some of these technologies into practice early.
Yeah. It leads me on to another point I wanted to raise to say, of course, I mean, Ori is an enabling technology company. I spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, and, I say the developers, the enabling technology companies in this space have, a fair amount of that responsibility to bear, right? If we, had brought more innovation to the market sooner, perhaps some of the companies that did launch products would have been more successful potentially. So we're certainly not blameless in this. And, Iovance and others are doing the best they can with the tools they've got to bring those products to patients and to have the clinical impact. One of the things that, we've been thinking quite a lot about is, traditionally to gain the benefits of automation or, higher throughput tools and technologies, we had to sacrifice on biology. We couldn't have our cake and eat it too. We had to have one or the other. And so, our ambition at Ori has always been to automate better biology, is to keep you as good or better on the biology side, but automate that process so you don't have to sacrifice and you don't have to make those trade-offs. And I wonder, if you see similar kind of issues in the historical lens and how we can convince researchers, ultimately this all starts in academia. It starts in research. That's where a lot of these programs emanate from. If we can help convince them that, okay, actually, I don't have to make those trade-offs anymore, and I can then future-proof my development plan. Because what we've been saying to partners, some partners that, we're talking to about these issues, is to say, those pharma licensing teams, those big pharma licensing teams, those therapeutics investors that are going to be the ones who help you move through the clinical pathway, they're not sure about viability either. And so they're taking a little bit of a skeptical view to say, we're not just financing any idea coming out of academia unless they've ticked all three of those boxes, safety, efficacy, or they have a pathway to tick safety, efficacy, and viability. And we see investors now looking at different areas. Radiopharm has been really sexy for the last year, ADCs, bispecifics. They're kind of looking away from cell and gene, like we're not quite sure about the commercial landscape over there, but these guys look more promising, more like what we're used to, whatever those things are. So saying to researchers, like, you've got this promising cell therapy program, but you got to tick this box early, in R&D to get that partner or to get that funding that's going to help, you realize your big ambition for your asset. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, traditionally, obviously, researchers haven't been necessarily the earliest adopters of technology, but I think it's important in this space.
It is slowly changing, I think, in pharma here in this context. I mean, you see a lot of AMCs, for example, developing and running at least early clinical trials for their own programs. So what does that mean? That means the researchers at the AMC directly are thinking about those initial steps of process and scalability and manufacturability. And I think that is impacting, their choice of tools, processes, upstream, earlier on. We're also seeing on the tools, on the enabling technology side directly, a lot of groups that are thinking about, regardless of what the technology is, thinking about creating effectively RUO systems that leverage the same core thing, the same core tech as what ultimately their GMP, system would. So that, the researchers can use it. And then effectively, there would be no scale-up risk, no transfer risk, because the GMP version is effectively just, the same thing, either parallelized, larger, what have you, for the case of that. I think it goes back to, historically, right, the researchers did their work. They threw it over the fence to process dev. Process dev, starts over, does their work, thinking about how to make it. If you can have more tools in the hands of researchers early on that are effectively GMP without the paperwork, even in the research setting, there can be a lot more interaction with process dev that makes process dev's life easier. Essentially just use the same equipment and keep going. Now, obviously the GMP version, and help streamline that. But you need biopharma to be thinking about that. You need the R&D team talking more closely to the process dev team and vice versa. But you're seeing that on the enabling technology side, these companies thinking about their market launches. And we do a lot of work there, in terms of kind of how do they design it? What is the first group to implement? You really do have to go to the researchers, kind of the upstream first. You can't go to process dev, because if you go to process dev and they already have something, they need GMP and they need it yesterday, or at least that's how the process dev team thinks. So you really do have to start with the R&D team. And so hopefully that does start, helping push and trickle down to now, streamline manufacturability earlier. Because the R&D team, whether they know it or not, is effectively using, GMP systems and equipment and processes.
No, exactly the way we've thought about it. And, we specifically didn't develop an RUO version and a GMP version. It's just the GMP version, GMP ready version, as you call it, ready to move into that space, but, obviously can move down as well without the paperwork. I like that.
Yeah,
exactly. I think you're right. Exactly. I mean, that really, it's we got to make it easy and we got to make it cost efficient for them to adopt these technologies early, because there's been traditionally two of the barriers in academia to them taking these things on. I wanted to just shift gears a tiny bit. I'd love to know more about your work in the industry, the kind of projects that you get involved in, particularly some of the things that we've talked about already, I'm sure. But where you're seeing some of the big where clients are coming to you with some big challenges, the kinds of things that you're seeing out there today that's really at the kind of forefront of the things that the therapy developers and enabling technology companies are thinking about today.
I mean, on the enabling technology side, I think it's exactly that kind of that market launch piece for them, trying to think through, what's the market plan? Who are the stakeholders or groups you need to actually launch and sell to? Everyone has aspirations to go, I'll sell to the manufacturing team. We'll just, high volume and we're done. Like it doesn't work like that. You can't go straight to the manufacturing team because they need a GMP today, which means they started looking for GMP 2 years ago. So you're already 2 years late. So it's a lot of work along those lines for the enabling technologies. Within biopharma, a lot of the kind of typical, competitive intelligence, forecasting. We built out our own, drug trackers, as I had mentioned. So we can do competitive intelligence and pipeline prioritization type work, really very quickly. But it is those enabling tools effectively that can help drive some of this innovation. So a lot of work there. With the investor hat on, we think deeply about where is their need, but similarly from that viability standpoint, of a enabling tool, can they launch it out to pharma? Is there a specific group that they can market to and gear the offering to? That has to be critical. If you have a GMP system and you just want to plug it away, good luck. So it's thinking about those sorts of things in our venture fund, as well.
What role do you think digital plays here? So we've talked a fair amount about automation tools or technologies, which mostly are physical technologies. They're sort of things that sit on a bench or do other things. What role does digital play? Because this tends to be one of the lower priority items in my experience with our biopharma partners. Maybe they've got tools in their factories already, like, manufacturing automation systems and MES systems and other things. But when they're thinking about the things that are on fire in their cell and gene therapy franchise, it's rarely the legacy paper processes that they're still using in R&D or in clinical that we hear most about.
Yeah, that's right. There's tremendous room for improvement, but I agree with you, Jason. Like that's one of those old habits die hard. That's probably going to be one of the last things, to go. But again, when you think about the process, particularly in the case of, say, an autologous therapy, again, you need to track the inbound. You need to track that material through manufacturing. You need to track that product on outbound, back to that patient. There are a lot of touch points along that process. And it isn't so much within a step where things go wrong. It's the between step where things go wrong. When, logistics receives the material and is handing it off to manufacturing. When manufacturing is, handing it back to logistics, getting it on the plane. We've heard stories of material, falling off the conveyor belt, getting loaded into the airplane, and things like this. And what does that do now for, that patient who had a scheduled infusion date for that clinic? Obviously, you're not going to obviate, mistakes and these sorts of things in moving product. But if you can have a better view of where does a product stand in the process, when is it going back to the patient, that can then interface with basically the physicians scheduling their patients, to get their material. So tremendous value and benefit in digitizing this process, having your dashboards. But that's the most difficult part probably to do because you have such siloed groups in biopharma. Every one of those individual groups has their own tracker effectively. None of the trackers talk to each other, and how do you solve that? It's that in-between point So it's probably creating something that effectively handles everything. You adopt one system, it's got a tracker that's doing it all effectively.
Yeah, I think it is those kind of handoff. I think, most systems, they would say the handoff points are where a lot of the risk is. And, we've built the system, the Ori system, to be cloud native, IoT, connectable through API. I can pass data to any system that's got a similar setup. I can pass it into an e-batch record or an MES or data historian or to a CIC, COC, COI provider, or whoever needs the information, or and vice versa. And having kind of an open source approach rather than, I think traditionally closed approaches around this haven't worked very well. But, I think we're just trying to scratch the surface of the power of this digitization process. We've done over 500 runs in the system now. We've got therefore 500 runs of data. And we're just starting to look at it and say, trying to form a hypothesis to test against that data set. And, one is, can we accurately predict cell counts without going in and taking a sample? We think we can with very high correlation. But, it's these kinds of queries. I don't know what your back of the napkin number is. I've heard numbers between 10 and 40% as failure rates in these processes, in these manufacturing processes. And they probably start out closer to 40 or 50, and then they come down, hopefully. But I don't know how close we are to, single digits. Certainly, it's still pretty challenging. But, our hope is to be able to deliver adaptive manufacturing. So the system begins to sense where the cells are in their process.
Jason, now you're talking really crazy. All right, we gotta.
I know. I'm really down the road here. This is at least 7 years away, not 7 months away. But you need enough data to be able to convince the regulator that you can do this safely. But it's not out of the realm of possibility, right? To say actually your cells and my cells might behave a bit differently because of your treatment pathway versus mine, or because of genetics or whatever. Could we try and hone in on an adaptive manufacturing process to deliver the same result? Because that's ultimately what the regulator wants. They want the same safe and effective product to come out of the process every time, and for us to validate that that's the case. And right now we can't do it. And I would argue we're actually already doing adaptive manufacturing. We're just calling it deviation management. A deviation happens.
Yeah.
Smart person comes in, says, we do this now. Like, okay, we do that now. But that's not possible at scale. So this is some of the important to build that digital framework and that digital foundation to be able to do some of these things that will benefit patients and benefit the industry as a whole.
I think you're right. And, our experience is most biopharma are thinking about this, thinking about it now, but in sort of a dip to toe, type of way, obviously not diving in. What I think is really interesting is within, cell and gene therapy, people think about, okay, how do I do this, kind of inline, real-time control of my process, to your point, and they're just starting to think about it. Where this has been, or there's at least a group that's been pushing this for a while. It's the continuous manufacturing folks. This is effectively just continuous manufacturing. We had the first continuous manufacturing approval for small molecules, I think in 2015. But that's effectively what that field is. You're making it on demand, in real time. Your analytics as a result are real time. And as a result, you're making changes to the process in real time, based on that feedback. And so in some ways it's new, but in some ways it's really not new, this idea. And I think you're right. Regulators obviously will have to get comfortable with it. Understand, what's your algorithm, how you're making these decisions. But I think, before that, biopharma is slowly appreciating that they could still use this. They could still use it in a non-regulatory facing manner. To your point about the failure rates, we have kind of batch failure rates. I think our number is 25%, something like that. If pharma has the technology to know, say a batch won't get to its final numbers, they can kill it early. They don't have to, that's nothing, regulatory facing. They kill it, start a new process, start it over. But they killed it early. They free up that line, free up some of that cost and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and save the remaining time to make the next batch and hopefully get that to the patient, quickly. So
exactly, get it faster. So I think there's a lot of room there for biopharma to adopt some of these technologies and processes in that non-regulatory facing way. But again, this is This is all from the continuous manufacturing folks who, generally looked at like a little skeptically for years and years and years. But maybe their day in the sun is coming.
Yeah, and this isn't a million miles away from where we are in biologics, right? Kind of real-time monitoring and intervention in the biologic space can be done, but you're doing it for tens of thousands of batches or hundreds of thousands of batches at a time. It's just this idea of personalizing the process around a patient's cells that sounds a bit scary, but makes sense. Where GMP is, you do the same thing in the process, you validate, you put the same ingredients in the front end, and you get the same result out the back end. That's GMP. But today we're putting a variable input into a standard process. So of course we're getting a variable output, and that's we need this. We need this adaptive manufacturing to drive that standardized output, which is ultimately what everyone's trying to get to. And you mentioned one of the things earlier that I think is preventing us from getting there, and that's analytics. Just the kind of, in a lot of these processes, we're flying blind. We're using lab scale tools and, human beings holding bags of cells up to the light. What do you see? Like, that's literally where we are as an industry. So that's certainly one of the rate limiters, is kind of better analytics, better insight into what's happening in our processes. Are there other ideas you have of what kind of unlock that opportunity, and what kind of other innovations might be necessary, either for that or for the industry, things that have got you excited on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, within the enabling tools piece, again, it's the QC/QA. I think that's kind of the drum we've been beating for a couple of years now, thinking about ways to even take like a fingerprint of the cells, take it going in, make sure that last cell going in was similar enough to the first cell going in. Take the fingerprint during manufacturing, take it after. Technologies like that, more real, or assays that can get to better potency in real time. So, cancer killing curves, these sorts of things, but in more physiologically relevant, settings effectively, really to push those sorts of things. In terms of kind of the field as a whole, I think it's the manufacturability, looking for more distributed manufacturing. We think about as well kind of some of these unit operations, plugging those together, having some umbrella automation over the top, but distributing it. And I don't mean bedside distribution necessarily, because I don't think you necessarily need that, but you do need some distribution of your manufacturing. I think Vertex has done this in a nice way with their centers of excellence and this kind of thing. So that's what we're watching, moving away from I ship everything across the world to this one point,
and then back again.
And I ship it all, back out. I'm, when something goes wrong, I got to charter the private jet to carry, the second batch to the patient again. True story. We've heard that one.
I heard that a couple weeks ago. If it goes wrong, we'll just charter a plane. I'm like, oh boy, that doesn't sound like a great solution.
Yeah, you're like, that's $200,000 right there.
That's going to cause a mess.
And was the plane GMP certified?
Right. Was your chain of custody in the airplane? But it underpins this kind of decentralized idea, which I agree with you, isn't bedside for sure, but it's probably basement of the hospital or regional center of excellence, or there's multi-site manufacturing. Makes sense. Requires automation to really do that well, probably, and get the regulator comfortable that you're delivering the same product in multiple places. And also requires digitalization, because you're never going to do that on paper. I mean,
I was going to say, exactly. Tracking now all, and coordinating all those multiple centers.
Yeah, that's an absolute nightmare. So being, fully digital and having some, at least the major components of it automated, are, I think, prerequisites for us to do decentralized well. And that's probably not the remainder of 2024's challenge. We've got other, fish to fry this year. But I wonder what your predictions might be for 2024. What do you expect to see when we're in December, kind of looking back on the year? What's got you excited or maybe worried about CGT in the short term?
Yeah, I think it's mostly around the market viability piece. We expected this year the pullback in I&I type applications. We expect, a really close look at the manufacturing model finally. Companies not really turning a profit, putting out these therapies, and you can't lose money forever. So taking a close look there, and I think it's still obviously an open question mark, how biopharma, how the field, handles this. We saw news out today on Solaris with BMS expanding that agreement. So I think there's appetite there. We have Ori, hopefully going to release a little bit of data here upcoming. We're excited about that.
Yeah, we're launching end of May. You're going to see the whole platform. So it's going to be out there in the public domain, which is exciting.
Yeah, we're excited. We want to have a look at that. But I think it's those sorts of challenges, and it's, those aren't going to be solved this year either. But I think biopharma is finally saying, oh shoot, we really got to take a close look at this. And the evidence points would be groups like, Gilead's Kite recently getting approval for, I think it was cutting, 2 days off their manufacturing process. When I look at that, something like that, to go through the pain of, revalidating, interfacing with regulators to get that 2-day approval or shortening of 2 days in their process, that gives me hope, because I imagine that 2 days of, cutoff time had to come, at least to some extent, from better assays, kind of the QC QA front. I mean, I don't think they magically somehow cut 2 days off their expansion time. So that kind of gives me the confidence. Groups are finally, okay, they're looking at this. They're thinking about better assays, better technologies, potentially, real time or inline, to really help drive that. I think we've looked at the process and we've optimized that as far as it's going. I don't think cells need to grow. There's no shortcut around growth time, and this sort of thing. So I think the industry is doing it, but need a closer, more attention there for the rest of the year.
Well, our hope is definitely that we can make some of these processes more efficient. We are seeing shorter expansion times. We're hoping to get to target doses in 5 or 6 days instead of 7 or 8 days. But it still doesn't solve the big problem, which is we need to produce 10,000 doses. And so shortening by 2 days is great, but we need to increase throughput, lower costs, shrink facilities, distribute them around close to patients. And all those things need to happen quickly for us to open up access, which is really the big measuring stick that I'm focused on. So,
yeah, which is one of the points is obviously just the funding. I mean, right, biopharma is going to be fairly reticent to try and build out a totally new process and adopt new technologies if the funding isn't there. I think knock on wood, we're seeing a little bit of that improve. I think the deals announced at JP Morgan just the first day this year eclipsed everything, all the deals announced, last year's. And you're seeing a bit more investment. You're seeing on the PE side more asset availability. So groups, selling their groups, because I think that's also been a significant issue of just asset availability. So we're seeing all those kind of indicators come back, and hopefully improves funding as well for biotech, and that can allow them a little bit of that breathing room to say, all right, let's look at this process now.
Yeah. Well, on that positive note, I'll thank you for spending the last hour with us, Carl. Really appreciate it. And I think we have a shared optimism for 2024, and certainly as we run into 2025, assuming the funding market's there, I think we can expect great things for the industry. So fingers crossed, and look forward to seeing you maybe at ISCT for Ori's launch, but if not, hopefully soon after.
Yep, we'll see each other soon at a meeting. That'd be great.
Thank you.